Currently, as you see these battle lines shifting, Iran's emerging as being maybe possibly the speaker for Islam. How is it showing its capability? When it shoots down an American drone, not only is it saying to the Islamic world, look, we're the only ones who are standing against the United States and the West and the great Satan, but at the same time, they're saying, look at Saudi Arabia. While we're standing against them, Saudi Arabia is striking deals with them.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
On today's show, we're going to be talking a lot about what's going on in the Middle East, and that includes Syria, Iraq, and Iran. We've been talking about the challenges that are being faced in northwestern Syria right now, in Idlib and Hama and that area, with the Free Syrian Army being fought against or bombed by the Syrian government and the Russians, and it's the civilians who suffer there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But first, I want to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Sangari. He's the CEO of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement and the founder of the United Assyrian Appeal. Lieutenant Colonel Sangari, thank you very much for being with us. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to this point.
It's good to be here. Well, I was born in Iran. We immigrated to the United States when the Iranian Revolution began. I served 20 years in the U.S. military, both infantry and special operational forces. Had 6 years of continuous combat operations. I have held a diplomatic position in Kuwait. Once I retired, I established the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement on September 11, 2014, in honor of the 3,000 Americans that were murdered on our soil. From there, first thing that we did was to consult the Christian military forces, in this case what we refer to as Assyrian army forces, that at that time were positioned in defensive positions and operationally in northern Iraq, and also did combat operations in Syria. Once we pulled them off the battlefield, once the Mosul clearing operations had ended, we continued our advisory for the Assyrian structures with the National Security Council, the Department of State, Office of the Secretary of Defense.
I was over there in February and kind of was reporting on the end of the fight against ISIS there, but ISIS has not really ended. I mean, their caliphate has been destroyed. But here's the big question that is being asked right now. It seems like many of the men who were fighting for ISIS actually ended up, after the fall of Raqqa, just sort of changing clothes or changing uniforms and going to fight for the Free Syrian Alliance or even for the Turks. Do you know? Can you speak to that?
Well, look, they're going to go where the weapons are and where the money is. The ideology is not dead. Just because you defeated a unit structure, as you know, on the ground, it doesn't mean that you've defeated these type of forces that have been trained to do decentralized operations. You could see them manifest themselves anywhere throughout the entire globe. So, look, Syria, the problem is we've created so many different type of organizations that, unfortunately, as I've been interviewed before, I've said Syria may have to bleed for the next 40 years until these different factions wipe each other out.
That's right. It seems like that just about everybody in the world wants a piece of Syria right now, wants to fill that vacuum left by ISIS. Israel obviously has some real interests in that area, and their interest is to keep Iran out. Iran obviously wants to create that Iranian crescent all the way to Lebanon, and so that they can more easily supply Hezbollah. There's a lot of Hezbollah fighters in Syria, Russia, the United States, the Kurds, on and on and on. All the different PMUs, many of whom fought in Iraq and are still there in Iraq. Tell me about the now. Explain this to me. This is something that I've always kind of wondered about. When a couple trips ago, when I was in Iraq during the fight for Mosul, we ran into a provisional military unit that was flying we were told when they rolled up, don't take any pictures, don't film these guys, they will flat kill you. And we were told they were being commanded by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, and they're very, very bad dudes from what we were told. However, I happened to get talking to a few of the guys. Amazingly, one of them spoke English. He was from Boston. And he said, no, we're Assyrian Christians. He said, we've got Muslims here too, but we've got a lot of Assyrian Christians. We're fighting for our homeland. How did that work? How did they have Assyrian Christians mixed in with these very bad dudes in this Hashishabi?
Well, the problem is that look, we had a force structure on the ground. The Assyrian army was conducting operations both in Syria and Iraq. However, the State Department and the rest of the U.S. apparatus was trying to push for some kind of force structure for the Christians. So the only thing they were able to come up with was a protection unit style force, which is in this case referring to the men and women of the Nimba Protection Unit. Unfortunately, what they did was they gave them only two options for Assyrian Christians under the previous administration. When we went to the State Department, they said, look, you have to either take all the forces that are out there, you have to put them either under this particular security structure at that time, which was being controlled by al-Hashishabi, Iranian aligned militias, which were the old Quds force that you and me probably fought against in Iraq, or you have to go to join the Kurds, which was neither a victory for the Assyrian Christians, because the Kurds and the Iraqi Arabs are both fighting over the piece of terrain. In this case, we call it Assyrian Nimba Plain, which is a historical homeland of the Assyrian Christians. However, certain segments of the Assyrian community took that option, which took our boys and placed them under the control of Hashishabi. We refused to take that stand. So when the Mosul clearing operations ended, we pulled the Assyrian army off the battlefield. We could always bring it back, constitute it again, take the boys of the MPU, take the boys that we have that are serving under the Peshmerga force structure and put them into one large Assyrian army force structure. But that is a decision that has to be made through U.S. systems, which currently are not established to want to support that.
Well, let's talk about the Nineveh Plains Council. This is a group of Orthodox and Assyrian Christians, that are saying they would like to push for their own semi-autonomous region, almost like Kurdistan, in the Nineveh Plain. So to have an enclave for Christians to go and to live safely in Iraq. What's your opinion on that and the chances of that ever actually happening?
Well, it doesn't even need to be a safe haven. You could just make it another province, basically, because really that's pretty much what the structure of the KRG at that time was, and currently referred to as the Iraqi Kurdish North, where you had provinces, and these provinces put together became a governmental structure. The Assyrian Christians do have their right historically to be able to have the Nimba Plain as a province, which allows them by the Iraqi constitution to have self-governance for themselves, so they can elect their leadership rather than have either the Kurdish North come down and tell them who they need to elect, or have Baghdad pretty much say how your force structures are. The only thing that would save the Assyrian Christians, in this case, when I say Assyrian Christians, I'm putting all the religious denominations that are within that region under one collective. It will allow that particular ethnicity, which has a historical claim to that land, to be able to have its own force structure and their own command and control. Assyrians and other Christians are not returning to Nimba Plain, Assyrian Nimba Plain, because there's no security. They cannot guarantee it.
Yeah.
That if another attack takes place, that these force structures are commanded by either the Iranian aligned militias or the Kurds, who have no interest for the Assyrians to have that piece of property to be able to fight and hold ground in support of the Christians.
There were, something like 700,000 Christians in Iraq before ISIS. Is that right? Or would you say it was more than that?
No, I mean, if you want to go to 2003, we're looking at 1 million.
Okay.
And we put all those under Assyrian Christian because Assyrian is an ethnicity.
Right.
They're different in religious denominations, and sometimes they refer to themselves as Chaldean, Syriac, or Orthodox, but it doesn't matter. All of them, ethnically wise, are the same people. Okay. You're looking at maybe right now, all those numbers combined, you're at 150,000 left. The problem we have is the most recent actions that Iran was taking in Assyrian River Plain was supporting the Shabak, with our Shia capabilities, to start building villages within Assyrian River Plain. And once you build a village and put individuals in it, it's very difficult for any form of a government to come in regionally or even out of Baghdad and say you have to remove your capabilities. Look, we even had a elected official in the Iraqi parliament, in Assyrian, who recently was forced to possibly have to step down because Iran wanted their individual to be placed in a position. So there's a lot of pressure from Iran on the Baghdad regime.
It's important to remind people, I think, that Iran is working very hard to have as much influence in Iraq as possible. And the Shia government of Iran I would say the Shia government in Baghdad sort of leans that way anyway, since Iran is also Shia, and the people in the north were Sunni, and that Sunni Shia divide, it cannot be understated, I think. Let's move on for a second and talk about the relations between the United States and Iran. What in the world is happening right now? What are we seeing play out on the news as basically our two governments trade insults and threats? And are we going to end up going to war with Iran, or what?
Well, look, anything's possible, but I was asked a week ago as to what is happening within the region, and I told them, look, we need to show patience in the process, and we don't want to get involved in this fight. This is an internal fight between the Shia and the Sunni as to who will be the speaker for all of Islam on the global stage. Now, initially, Turkey was jockeying to be the global leader for Islam itself, being the Erdogan saw himself as being the next Sultan of Islam. Iran was jockeying to be the representative of all of Islam, specifically the Shia Islam. And Saudi Arabia saw itself as being the leader of all Sunni Islam, Wahhabist type of ideology. Currently, as you see these battle lines shifting, Iran's emerging as being maybe possibly the speaker for Islam. How is it showing its capability? When it shoots down an American drone, not only is it saying to the Islamic world, look, we're the only ones who are standing against the United States and the West and the great Satan, but at the same time, they're saying, look at Saudi Arabia. While we're standing against them, Saudi Arabia is striking deals with them, to include deals with Israel on security matters. So it's marginalizing Saudi Arabia. Erdogan, who taught himself to be the next speaker for the entire Islamic world, just lost very significant election in Turkey, where his party actually got a minority of the vote from the previous election. So it seems like his sultanic aspirations are done. Now, for us, when we're advising the National Security Council, and we've done this multiple times, we've said, show patience. And I think under the current administration, you see the current POTUS taking steps that are really targeting the hardliners themselves within Iran and allowing this process to kind of play out.
So once it does play out, if we do show patience, do you think that some of these problems will sort of resolve themselves between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Well, they're always going to be there, but I think they're showing there's chinks in this armor. Now, Iran will always be there because geographically where it sits, it has a much more of a broader capability. Look, Alexander the Great burned Iran from one end of it to another. Greece is nowhere on the international level where Iran is today. The Mongolians came and burned Iran. Mongolians are marginal given where Iran is. The Arabs tried to do the same thing. You could even go back and say that the Romans had their armadas in the Persian Gulf. Look where Rome is today and look where Iran is. Iran will always sustain because of its geography and the mentality of those people within Iran itself. However, go ahead.
Well, I imagine that it would take approximately 30 seconds for us to sink Iran's entire navy.
Yes, it would.
And so the question is, what would their capabilities be if we were to strike them militarily?
No, it's not that. They know they're going to lose in a battle. Look, the Iranian hardliners have always wanted to fight against the United States ever since the Islamic Revolution.
Just for
so even if the
victory.
That's it. Even if you go to war with them for 1 hour, they win.
Yeah.
We may not understand that they won, but they win within the context of what I just described in this global fight of who's going to win the hearts and minds of the Muslim world. And that's what they're trying to do. I think the president targeting sanction-wise against the leadership of Iran, in this case the hardliners, is really allowing the process to work itself out. How is he allowing that to happen? Let's take it as an example. When he puts the new sanctions against the hardliners, basically saying, I'm going after your assets. Now, the Iranian people who are starving today, who know that all the power sits in the hardliners' hands, first questions from there is going to be, hey, wait a minute, how is it possible that you are an individual who says that U.S. and the West are the evil that Islam has to fight against, but you have assets that you have built in Europe and in other places, possibly to include the United States. So, and that's our money that we gave you, and you're using it there. So this is a way for the president to really break this narrative that Iran is, lead for Islam within the region. Iran, Saudi, Turkey, all of them have to eventually come to bear that this fight that they're having cannot be fought on the global scale. And with hopefully the moderates, for the better term, winning within the region, within Iran, maybe we could get to a point where we could have an agreement struck with them on the nuclear issue.
Let's pray that happens. Well, thank you very much, Colonel Sangari. I really appreciate this. Folks, we're getting to hear from a preeminent expert in the field and in that region. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's very useful and helpful for our viewers. So we pray God's blessing on your work, and we hope that we'll have you on again sometime. Thank you again.
No, thank you again. Anytime, and I want to thank you for your service. It isn't easy being a ranger, but the Rangers lead the way. And, you're doing yeoman's work for the nation. Much appreciated.
All right.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.